Thanks to It in 2017 and now The Long Walk in 2025, I think we're going to experience a phenomenon where every 10 years or so, the next generation gets really into Stephen King. I think we are destined, fated, to introduce the next generation to Tumblr-ready angst that can only be found in Stephen King's novels about teenagers or children. And hey, I get it. I read Carrie in 7th grade. I read the book It in however old you are when you're 11. Is that 6th grade? Look, I've cosplayed Richie Tozer. I'm not immune to this. I've seen Misery a trillion times as an adult. This is my 2nd edition copy of Misery I wanted to show off because it has one of his original author photos in the background. This is from 1982. It's actually, I'm not gonna show the name, but it's from a teacher's library. It's cool. Anyway, and I just saw The Long Walk and I wanted an excuse to talk about it. In a non-academic colloquial setting, this is just you receiving like a 20-minute FaceTime call from me. I want to talk about Stephen King, I want to talk about The Long Walk, and I wanted to share you guys this very funny joke that exists between me and my dad, which is that Stephen King has curses attached to his work. 5 curses to be exact. And I'm going to share those 5 curses of Stephen King with you all while talking about The Long Walk. Here's a quick disclaimer that if you have not seen The Long Walk movie or read The Long Walk book, I will be talking about both fully with spoilers present. If you've only seen the movie and not read the book, you'll still be able to get something from this. But if you haven't seen the movie, I don't think you're going to get much from this. So watch the movie, come back here. You can also choose to read the book and come back here. I do highly recommend it. It is more graphic and gory and explicit than the movie. So I would double check the trigger warnings on the book before you engage, but overall, I recommend both. This is purely self-indulgent. I wanted to talk about an adaptation I enjoyed. I hope you now enjoy this. Here are the 5 curses of Stephen King. Since there are 5 of them, this is in a conveniently numbered list. Number 1. All boys will be in love with each other, but no one will be gay. Fans of the It movies are crazy familiar with this one. This is a fun one to debate with Stephen King fans that are like in their 40s, like the 40-year-old men that really like Stephen King. This is a fun one. Throughout Stephen King's works, there are very interesting homoerotic undertones with all of the male characters, but I think this is not due to any intention of Stephen King himself. Self-admittedly, it's not. I don't think we're dealing with any kind of genuine queer rep. I think what we're dealing with is a very interesting take on masculinity that can only happen in the absence of women, or specifically the absence of a love interest. There is a really interesting paper written about the movie Deliverance, and it's written about masculinity in film, and it talks about how because there are no major female characters, the connections between the men default to romantic or erotic. This is a phenomenon you see a lot in a lot of media. This is why so much shipping inherently exists. Take Supernatural, for example. None of the men have long-term female love interests that have a personality or a unique plot or exist for much longer than a season, and because of that, a lot of the male characters end up shipped with each other because they genuinely have more emotional tension and more emotional history with each other than any woman. Inherently, the story becomes homoerotic due to a lack of women. But I don't think that this is the only reason why Stephen King's novels tend to lean a little sus, a little fruity. I think a big part of this genuinely, especially for The Long Walk, is King's inspiration when it comes to masculine bonds, which is why I think The Long Walk is a really good example to talk about this curse where all the men are in love with each other but no one will be gay. I sometimes call this the Sam and Frodo effect, the idea that a war movie will inherently be gay because of the nature of how men will bond with each other during war. And yes, The Long Walk is a war movie. So Stephen King famously based The Long Walk off of the Vietnam War, or at least stories he heard of the Vietnam War. He wrote this as a teenager. It's funny, in a Reddit AMA, he said he wrote it to impress a girl, which is interesting because of all the gay in it. He had his eyes on a Fujo. I get it. A lot of war movies and war stories are super gay. This is because of a genuine lack of women in extremely traumatic situations where people need emotional support, need to basically find a partner, a life partner. There's something about the human psyche that allows us to adapt to the type of love we need at the time really well. And in a lot of war stories, you will see these men having wife-like bonds with other men. It's a survival instinct. It's because you want love, you want attention, you want connection, you want to feel human, and nothing is more human than having a partner. There's this moment in the Long Walk book where Ray Garrity talks about he doesn't care about if he's queer or if Pete is queer. He just wants to be touched. He just wants to feel human. And that's like the thesis for all male connection in war stories. The Long Walk adaptation, in my opinion, is very successfully filmed as a war movie. It was very hard for me to separate war movie analytics from this film, which I think is a good thing. I think that's a huge strength for the adaptation. Specifically the scene in the movie, for example, where they are walking up the hill and their comrades are dropping around them to gunfire 111, and you just see Ray having to zone in, and you see Pete trying to carry him along, and it feels like they're on a battlefield. It reminded me of the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. That is a huge compliment. I think that was so well done in the film. And this war movie energy and the war movie vibe carried on to the connection between the men. It made me very happy that they kept in some of my favorite queer lines from the book. It also felt like to me they developed the queerness significantly more in the film. I have had a debate about this with a 36-year-old man recently who genuinely believes there is nothing gay in this movie and it's just a perfect example of healthy masculinity. I push back on that by saying healthy masculinity also includes being in love with other men. This is healthy masculinity, especially with a queer reading. I think it's less healthy masculinity to deny queerness at all in this piece, especially when Ray Garrity's last words are, "I love you, Pete." If they were straight, if one of them was a girl, this would be the most clear-cut example of like a straight relationship, in my opinion. They probably would have even kissed. I think this is just one of those moments where being a queer person watching movies is going to be significantly different than being a straight person watching a movie. But, you know, The Long Walk is not the only place where Stephen King has the all men will be in love with each other, but no one will be gay plot. But what's interesting about this, in general, in all of Stephen King's work, is he does have the occasional queer character, but they are almost always background characters, or they're almost always adult predators. Put a pin in that, that is a different point on this list. But the side queer characters, for example, they were included for a reason. No matter what Stephen King's politics have aged into today, he was a liberal, pro-feminist author, pro-gay author. He was a liberal progressive for the 70s and 80s, right? Again, not everything has aged perfectly. This is due to the nature of, again, the 70s and 80s were a drastically different time for many things as opposed to now and how we handle political topics and marginalized identities. I do not think a lot of his stuff has aged particularly well, but for the time and the context it was in, it was extremely liberal and progressive, and that includes his inclusion at all of gay characters. Did his gay characters almost always die? Yes, but they always die in hate crimes, and you're supposed to learn from that. Take that however you will. But also his displays of masculinity were progressive for the time as well. So you have to kind of look at the idea of all boys are gay but no one is in love from a few different angles. The contextual angle of the time, the fact that this was very interesting displays of masculinity in media for the time, and then also from then the queer angle, which is a more modern lens looking at how these men are with each other. Why do I consider this a curse of Stephen King though? Why do I consider the all boys will be in love but no one will be gay a curse? Because then no one is gay. Because these men are in love, and they always die in each other's arms, and they're always talking about how much they love each other, and they're always going everywhere together, and they're basically soulmates, but no one's ever gay, and they always end up married to evil women. All the women are evil that they're married to. Have you noticed that? Put a pin in that. But also just like, as a gay person, can they just be gay? No, says Stephen King. No, they cannot just be gay, but they will be in love. Doomed love. But never gay. The second curse of Stephen King is very similar to the first, in the sense that it is once again a display of a marginalized group that does not age well for various reasons, which is the idea that the black characters in Stephen King's books will be the nicest, coolest, kindest people in the entire novel, but they will be called the N-word a minimum of 4 times per book. This is a literal statistic. He just throws that word around like confetti. Now, again, this is one of those weird moments, where I am not saying that it is okay that he does this, that I'm not saying that it's like the best, that he throws that word around like confetti in all his media, but the reality is the bad guys are the ones that typically say it. Typically, it is said with intention. Is the execution of this good? Debatable, but Stephen King is trying to say a message that racism is bad in like all of his books, but he's doing it in a very weird way, not just because the characters get called slurs often, and not just because then black trauma fodder ends up being the actual like plot of these characters, but also because The act of putting a marginalized group on a pedestal is another way of othering them, is another form of discrimination. All of Stephen King's Negroes are magical. If you don't know what the magical Negro trope is, that is, first off, the name of the trope. I'm not just saying that. For the people who are uneducated that are going to start flaming me in my comments, please read a book. This is literally what the trope is called. I was taught this in school. That is what it is called. The idea of the magical Negro trope is that you have a character, like the name implies, typically a black character, who helps the white main character out through some form of like mysticism, some kind of wisdom, or some kind of literal magic. The idea is that this is a side character, very similar to the sassy black friend. Never a main character, never someone who gets a story of their own, but someone who acts as a plot device and accessory for your white main character. They are enriching the white main character's life in some way. And what is interesting about this is typically the magical Negro character has the full ability to handle this story himself. Typically, his magical powers or his wisdom is what could actually solve all the problems in the plot. But remember, they're not the main character. They are relegated to side character. They are only there to give the white character knowledge to have them succeed. To me, this kind of feels like a grandson of the mammy trope. The mammy trope is the idea of a black caretaking older woman to a white main character, also typically a girl. The trope of the mammy came from literal slavery. Certain enslaved women would work inside the homes of their slavers, and they would be in charge of taking care of all the children. They were seen as these motherly figures, but of course they could never have their own children. If they did, their own children were typically neglected for their slavers' children, since they were forced to be that nanny. And the mammy trope is like this wise older woman who just loves and cares so much for this white child, even more than her own children. Gone with the Wind kind of set the big tone for this trope, but you do see it everywhere in early film. And I would consider the magical Negro the grandson of the mammy trope because the idea of, once again, full of wisdom, strictly there to enrich a white person's life, no thought process of their own, just here to vibe with your white main character. And Stephen King has a lot of those because his magical Negroes typically come from this mentality of he wants the black character in the media to be like perfect. He is trying to deconstruct racism in a very non-successful way by putting black characters on a pedestal to where they only have perfectly good characteristics to the point of being literally inhuman, almost supernatural. While this is not about race and is about gender, there is an interesting conversation that happened with the creators of It's Always Sunny, where they were talking about how in the first season, Dee, the only girl character in the main cast, she was kind of like an everyman. She was played more straight. She was a woman who was very secure in herself, surrounded by idiots. But the problem is, that is also a sexist trope. The idea that women are so emotionally mature and so perfect and so flawless that they can't be a dumbass, that is also sexism. Which is why then, in almost every season after the first, Dee's just as crazy, if not worse, than the rest of the gang. When white authors are often scared of giving black characters negative tropes or problems, or honestly, in my opinion, just the things that contribute to a proper plot, that is a form of othering. That is a form of racism. You are so scared of doing something wrong that you set black characters completely opposite of white characters by giving them no life. They are props. They are perfect, but they are props. And this is where Stephen King's magical Negro trope comes in. You have this absolutely perfect, flawless, kind character who will be described as being perfect, flawless, and kind, but will be called a slur a bunch of times, and will have all the problems, solved already, but they can't solve them themselves. They have to give it to the white main character. Just watch The Green Mile. Just watch The Green Mile. Read The Green Mile. You'll understand what I'm talking about when it comes to Stephen King and his interactions with black race. But what does that have to do with The Long Walk? Well, there are black characters in The Long Walk book. And then you also have our antagonistic racist who throws the N-word around like confetti. But the movie kind of shifted some things around, which both fixed this trope and fixed this curse, and also sometimes made the curse a little worse. So in The Long Walk movie, Pete McVries, who was white in the books, is now played by a black actor. Which, side note, David Johnson was 100% like the star of The Long Walk. I had never seen him in anything before because I hadn't seen the Alien movie he was in, but now I kind of want to see him in everything. His range was crazy, but that's not the point. But by making Pete McVries black. The vibe is drastically changed from the book. In my opinion, for better, but also while changing his race, they changed a few other things about him as well, and that's where this curse kind of starts to rear its head again. They took out all of the slurs. The character of Gary Barkovich is no longer a raging racist in the movie. Now he's just kind of a dick, which is fine. I don't need movies that say a bunch of slurs in rapid succession. I am fine with that change. And that's how they kind of avoid the curse, but they bring the curse back with how they changed Pete McVree's backstory. They are attempting to exit the sphere of race that Stephen King engages with, but they kind of brought us right back. Before I talk about that though, because that's going to lead us to our third curse, the changing of the backstory for Pete McVree's leads us to curse number 3. Real quick side note, I really did appreciate how The Long Walk did include the native representation that was present in the book. The scene itself was changed because one of the characters was removed, but I really loved what they did instead. I think it served the movie energy a lot more, and also I sobbed like a baby. It was just beautiful, and very powerful, and very dark, and I don't think a single person in my theater, made it out of this movie without crying, but, that was the scene where, I heard the most sniffles. But the changing of Pete McVree's backstory that leads to him being put on a racial pedestal, possibly, leads us to our third curse, and the third curse of Stephen King is women. Just women. As I was kind of saying before, King exists in a very weird liminal space where a lot of his works were very progressive for the time period that he was in. Carrie was huge. Genuinely, Carrie is a feminist work of the time. It is what it is. Whether or not you not agree with that in a modern context, that's fine, but at the time it was huge. That attitude of him wanting to be progressive still exists today, but I guess his execution and methodology behind it has not necessarily improved, so we're kind of stuck with this specific early 70s progressive feminism that doesn't really match our modern world. King shines when he does bring up things like menstruation, and when he does bring up stuff like the sexual assault that young women can go through. He handles it shockingly well, specifically in It and Carrie. There's the way that he handles the monstrous feminine and the way he handles women scared of femininity that was really interesting. And I think carries a lot of merit. But besides that, there is a lot of breasting boobily down the stairs, you know what I mean? Which leads us to the fact that I'm really happy that Ray and Pete's girlfriends were excluded from the movie, but also why that could have done something weird for Pete's character. So first off, I'm okay with the girlfriends being removed because I personally felt it was an adaptational necessity to remove the girlfriends. The Long Walk is not a long book, but it is absolutely packed to the brim with stuff. There's not a sentence that carries non-important information. It is very tightly written. It is essentially literary horror. Most of it takes place inside of a man's head with just a consistent narrative of thought. There isn't actually much going on. If you were to actually write down the stuff that happens out loud in the real world, there's not that much. So they had to take an internal piece of work and turn it to a piece of media that is exclusively external, something we're only engaging with visually. They had to take us out of Ray's head, which is why I think it was important to remove the girlfriends. A lot of things had to be adjusted and simplified, and I feel like this was one of the best ways to do that. None of the girlfriends really even make an on-screen, visually in the real world appearance in the books, except for Jan in one scene. And in the movie, Jan was replaced with the mom. In the book, Ray tries to give up and quit the Long Walk by jumping into Jan's arms, leaving the walkway, and being shot. He would essentially be dying in his girlfriend's arms, and he was fine with that. Pete stops him from doing that. In the movie, this is changed to a scene with his mother. I think that is significantly more impactful for the story that the movie was trying to tell. The girlfriends, at the end of the day, don't really matter in the book, which sucks, but it makes sense as well, because the book in itself is a war book, and the movie itself is a war movie, and it is telling the story of the Vietnam War, and there were no women enlisted in the Vietnam War. It is about these men and what they have left behind and how they have nothing now. It is good to show they have nothing now. It is good to show the girlfriends aren't here. They are left behind for us the same way they're left behind for the main characters. I get it. And not only all this, but obviously the movie was telling a different story than the book. You know what I mean? The book is a lot less about fighting the system and a lot more just the dread and capitulation that comes from having no hope within the system. The boys are just doing it. They're just doing the walk. They're doing the walk. They have no hope of escaping the walk. They're just doing the walk. In the movies, there is an actual consistent theme about going against society. The emotional core of the stories is near identical. This dread and despair can come from a story about overturning the system and from a story of living within the system. This was very interesting to me. But the story itself is not the same, and it's not being told the same way. And so the girlfriends don't serve the plot anymore. It does mean more for the girlfriends to barely even be mentioned in a sentence. A very gay scene, by the way. I've never seen two men look so long at each other while talking about how they don't have girlfriends. It's very common for female characters to be shoved to the side for the advancement of male characters. The actual act of this is neutral because all characters are plot devices and all characters should serve the story in the way they need to. It is only a feminist issue because it almost seems to exclusively happen to female characters. And that's where the socio-political problems with that trope comes into play. The frequency of which it only happens to marginalized groups and marginalized genders. It's like inevitable for characters to be used as plot devices because they are plot devices, but it becomes a theme and a pattern when you see it only happening to certain types of characters, which is why, again, one of Stephen King's curses is women. Every mom is either an angel or the worst person ever, or women are just breasting boobily, as stated. This movie gets a pass from that, like I said, because the girlfriends weren't important, and the mom has a lot of personal character to her. This is, though, still a statement about the patriarchy in the movie. It's just a statement of the patriarchy and how it affects men, which is interesting, which I liked. But how does this affect the character of Pete McVries? So in the book, Pete abused his girlfriend, his partner at the time. That's why he has his facial scar. She gave it to him after he attempted to non-consensually engage with her. At the time, marital rape was not even criminalized. Different conversations around consent were happening when Stephen King wrote this book, especially from his perspective as a white, straight man. I understand why the book plot was the way it was. And I kind of liked the book plot because of the morally gray edge that it gave McVries. And how much more impactful then, to me, it was that he was doing the long walk and the way he engaged with Ray on such a personal, intimate, emotional level, like it was interesting to me. There was something very deep and poignant about that. But it would not have worked in the movie, but I wish it would have. Modern audiences today would not receive that information well, especially coming from a black man. This is the truth. If you don't think this is the truth, I wish I lived in the naive world you were living in. It would be bad. Especially with the ending, how Pete ends up essentially being revealed to us as our true main character. That play would not go well with audiences if this black character also tried to commit an act of sexual assault. So the movie had to kind of pedestal the character of Pete McVries when they made him black, which is why they changed his backstory to then what I would consider an almost painfully stereotypical background for a black inspirational character. I think it works really well in the movie because I think David Johnson sells it. And I think Cooper Hoffman has such good chemistry with David to where I just think the thing was pulled off really well in the movie. But it did make me sad that they weren't trying to make Pete McVries more morally gray because I think David could have pulled it off. I agree about leaving the part out about sexual assault and why him and his ex-girlfriend did not work out. But I do think they could have added, I don't know, a little bit more punch to Pete's backstory so that he was not being put on a pedestal for, marginalized groups as this like magical inspirational black character for Ray. But I also understand why they didn't because the current political climate is awful and I can't even imagine what audiences, like the level of harassment David Johnson would receive for playing a more controversial character. I don't know. I wish we could trust modern audiences more, but we can't. And so we're here now. But anyway, I yearn for the day where marginalized groups don't have to be perfect on screen and still be able to be respected and loved, especially the actors. Anyway, now we move on to the fourth curse of Stephen King. This one's going to be a little bit different than the others because it's going to feel a little bit less generalized. Previously we've talked about queerness, race, and women. These are some pretty broad topics in media, but now we're going to talk about just the concept of adulthood. The fourth curse of Stephen King is that all adults will be predators, and if they are not predators, then they will die. They are so good, they must simply perish gruesomely on screen to make you feel something. So this is actually a point that resonated with me a lot as a child. When I was young, reading Stephen King books, it weirdly meant a lot to me that adults were always garbo. The world is a lot more darker, more sexual, and more twisted than we ever give it credit for. I think that's one of the reasons why I love the horror genre in general so much. I think it is the most human of the fictional genres. Everything is a lot weirder, than we allowed ourselves to talk about. Everything's just a lot more weird. And I feel like King captures that really well with the adults. There are so many different types of abuse that are showcased in Stephen King books as a part of the horror. And while the Long Walk book nor movie have a character that is an explicit sexual predator as an adult, there are characters that are deeply abusive as adults. Exhibit A being the Major, and then the character that is so good they simply must perish for us to feel, Ray Garrity's father. In the book, Ray Garrity's father, you don't know what happened to him. He was disappeared by the government. In the movie, we see very explicitly a street-side execution. I think the disappearing works much better than the street-side execution. Especially since I really thought they were gonna mirror, parallel, do some kind of interesting shot work to show how Ray's death is connected to his father's death. I kind of expected a shot-for-shot moment, especially with the final shot. The shot being shot, I expected something. But there wasn't anything. They didn't do that. So it confused me why they changed his death instead of just having him disappeared. Because I think a character being disappeared is a lot more impactful. If you're trying to critique the government, explicit evil is the obvious angle to take. But I think the more subtle evils speak more to everything happening in the world right now. One day, you expect your father to come home, and he hasn't. And then the government's like, you're shit out of luck. We took him, and you're never going to see him again. We've deported him. We've disappeared him. He's in our prison. He's with our people. I think that's a lot more impactful. I think they should have kept that in the movie. But no matter what, he was a good adult, which means he must perish. And meanwhile, the Major, gets to live on, at least in the book, despite being an abusive weirdo to the many women that he sires bastard children with. Which leads us to the decision to kill the Major in the movie. I love it. Obviously, I need to speak a little carefully for this next part. Obviously, the director could not predict modern events when making this movie. But damn, seeing this movie opening weekend was timed really well for unrelated events. And I think the message really got across there, unintentionally. That's not the director's fault, obviously, but it was to the director's benefit. I really thought while watching the movie we were about to completely ruin the ending or have some very weird messaging when Pete was telling Ray to let go of his anger and let go of his revenge plan, etc. Because I hate plots like that. I hate plots where the character chooses peace. That's one of the reasons why I love the ending of the Hunger Games saga, the original Hunger Games saga, so much, because Katniss never chooses peace. She always chooses the option that brings around proper revolution, and I think that having the director for the Hunger Games make this movie really sells this. I think this tracks really well for that, because essentially Pete McVries makes a choice of action instead of inaction. He actually goes on the opposition instead of choosing passivity, and I think that's just a very important message. But now that we're talking about the Major dying, that leads us to the fifth curse of Stephen King. The fifth and final curse. Soon you will be free, no more curses. But the last curse is that all his endings will either be bad or make no sense. The bad endings, you know exactly what's happening. The endings where you don't know what's happening, amazing ending. It's common knowledge that Stephen King struggles to stick the landing with his plots. I don't know if that's the coke or what, but sometimes he struggles when he gets to that last 30 pages. Salem's Lot is the ending that disappointed me the most ever out of any of his books. And just a personal side note. But The Long Walk was always one of my favorite endings because it never made sense. It is ambiguous, it is weird, it is trippy, and it really works. It creates this gray cloud. There is so much sadness and emptiness in the ending of The Long Walk that any other detail explaining more would have ruined it. And so for a moment there, in theaters, I struggled with the ending of The Long Walk. But after sitting on it for about 3 minutes, pretty quick turnaround, 3 minutes, I realized why it's so perfect for the movie. The book's ambiguity works because of who Ray is in the book. And the movie's ambiguity works because of Pete's hope. In the book, there is no hope from Ray at all. But in the movie, Ray even says, I can't see the hope. Book Ray is with us in that moment. He's like, yeah, no, I can't keep doing this. There's nothing there for me. I actually kind of really like the interpretation of Pete being that dark figure in front of Ray. In the books, I really like the interpretation of that. And then we have it very literally here, how Ray purposefully falls behind, sees that dark figure of Pete walking forward in the night, and then fights it. I really liked that. I like that Pete chose action. I like that Pete chose love and hope till the very end, because yes, him killing the Major was still an act of love, hope, and light. That was the point. He did it for love. He did it for Ray. Those were his last words. This is for Ray. Ray's last words being, I love you, Pete. Pete's last words being, this is for you, Ray. The last words we hear them say on screen are their names. Every boy will be in love, but no one will be gay. But what the Long Walk ending provided us with was a different form of hope, a different form of marching forward. The feeling of despair and the weightiness is still there, and I think that is important to note, is that hope can still be really fucking scary and dark, and hope can give you dread. Hope can give you despair. It sounds contradictory, but it's not. To have hope is to have doubt that the despair is gonna win, right? But that means the despair still has to be there. Despair has to be present for hope to be there. I felt that in the ending of The Long Walk. The ending works perfectly for the message that the film is trying to tell. But if Stephen King had written this ending in the book, it would have been, for lack of a better word, it would have been balls, because you'd be able to understand it. Stephen King gets real weird with his endings that you can understand. He tries to wrap up too many things, he tries to hammer in too much stuff to you, he's telling you what to think about his story, and it sucks. His ambiguous endings allow you to feel, and Stephen King, in my opinion, works best with emotions. I think this is where his books fall flat for a lot of people, is a lot of people going in expecting this solid plot, or something that makes sense. I think they're expecting something rational. But you have to go in with Stephen King reading emotions first. He is a heart writer, not a head writer. There's not much cerebral going on with his pieces. It's all emotionally driven, which is then when he's trying to tell you what to feel, why the ending sucks. So those are my personal 5 curses of Stephen King. In conclusion though, I really enjoyed the Long Walk movie as an adaptation. I feel like they fought against the curses of Stephen King really well, while also finding themselves falling into them just due to the nature of Stephen King. But I very much enjoyed it. I'm definitely going to be rewatching it. I'll probably go see it in theaters one more time before it leaves, just because I want to see it in HD one more. I don't have a great TV here, people, so when I say HD, I mean real HD. My TV's not the best. I think my TV's actually older than 2 of my cats, so. But I hope you enjoyed this kind of like chill sit-down video where I just get to yap about a movie for a bit. I promise you that the next video will have more academic stuff, much more teacher, much more my style. But listen, a guy's just gotta have fun sometimes. A boy's just gotta get on here and, you know, have a chill, fun time, autisming out with the bros. Let me know your thoughts on The Long Walk or in Stephen King in general in the comments. I'm dying to know. Let's all have a fun time kikiing in the comments over King. Also, if you have any good Ray and Pete fanfics, link them now.